Welcome to JCOPE. We are going to be giving you a much different version of the ethics seminar than the participants who have been coming here to take it as refresher training is. So the intent behind what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be kind of simultaneously presenting the material, as in you will see what each slide is. But we're also going to be explaining the material, the intent behind it. Where possible, we're going to give you the pitfalls that we've noticed, the places where participants have questions, the strategies that we've developed to move things along, and whatever else occurs to us that might be useful to you as you consider training this material. Now, just for the outset, I want to let you know that for an FDS filer, taking refresher training every 3 years is required for them. But they have two choices. They can either retake the CETC or they can take the seminar refresher course. Now, because they have a choice, we're passing that choice on to you. You all have the CETC materials, and that's part of your repertoire. We are in the process of updating that material for 2017. You may be happy to know there will be a cleaned up, prettier version. Marlena's taking the lead on that. So there will be an updated edition of that. We do expect to be able to provide trainer notes for that updated material. But we also want to give you the option of adding this course as an additional training material. Now, we say that that's going to be an option because the CETC, you've probably all seen it, it is very information dense. And part of that is because the way the statute was written for what is required of that material. And we know it is not the most thrilling, compelling material ever. We get that. The same limitations for training it fall on us too. But with this seminar, because the statute says that it shall be a refresher, we kind of use that as permission to take the foot off the brake a little bit. Because it's a refresher, we can assume that people have at least a basic understanding of what the ethics laws are. That may be faulty. We know that people don't retain information from the CETC, but that was our operating assumption when we started creating this course material. And people have been saying, wow, you know, it's really hard to just sit there and listen to an ethics lecture for 2 hours. So what we did with this material is we really tried to create a refresher course that was going to be more interesting, more inherently interesting, and get more participation and more discussion from the participants. Now, because of that, though, that's why we're making this optional. This is not going to be the type of training course where you can just stand there and read slides to people for 2 hours. And first of all, just in case you didn't get the memo, you no longer need to read it verbatim. We've been trying to message that bit by bit. You don't need to present the CETC verbatim. But in this particular training course, we definitely want to make sure that this is going to be more conversational and more discussion-based. So it requires more of you as a trainer rather than just standing there and reading slides for the CETC. So, all of that. I have a lot of words in me. I talk a lot. So with that said, we're going to introduce what the seminar course is about, what the intent behind it is, so that at the end, you can decide whether or not this is a course that's going to be suitable for your agency, whether or not it's something that you feel up to training, or if you have staff that you think is going to do a good job. If you see what you see today and you're like, yeah, that's nice, but no thank you, that's fine too. And at any time in the future, if you decide to change your mind about that and then offer it later, that's fine. We are intending on recording this production, so if anybody on WebEx has technical difficulties, we are planning on recording this. We're going to make this available online. We currently don't think that we're going to make it a public link, though. What we're going to do is, if you want the training materials, we will send you the training materials as well as a link to the broadcast so you can watch this again. Right? Because once isn't awesome enough. All right. So what you have in front of you, you should have, or for those of you who are participating in WebEx, you should have been sent two things. The first is the Train the Trainer guide. For those of you in person, it's a little spiral-bound thingy to do. Now, this contains the entire slide set, plus the trainer notes that we've developed to go along with it. So what we've tried to do is really script out so that if you're unfamiliar with training or you have staff that you're going to assign training to, If worse came to worse, they could just kind of like follow along the script. Okay? These are the same kind of training notes that we're developing for the CETC for next year, so stay tuned. The other thing that you should have is a copy of the Plain Language Guide to the Public Officer's Law. Now, this is the material that we are now giving out to all participants regardless of which course they take. It took us a while to get this approved through the attorneys. They really wanted to make sure that everything in here was in legal language, and we're like, it's a plain language guide. We need to explain this to people who aren't attorneys. It took a while. We finally got them to agree. So this is the material that we're giving out for both courses now. So keep that in mind, regardless of which course. Now, in the training notes here, we also made reference to where in our training materials you can find further information in that plain language guide. The guide is not meant to follow slide by slide with this training material, but when we hit upon a topic in the seminar, you can at least direct your participants to where they can find it in that guide so that if they have follow-up questions or need extra information, that guide is there for them. So we've given that to you. So I think I have done enough explanations of why we're here and what we're going to be doing. So let's dive into the material. For those of you who are participating via WebEx, just as a housekeeping thing, please keep your microphones on mute, just because we have about 30 of you who are participating via WebEx. Hi, everybody. So keep your microphones on mute, but we do have Josh, who is manning the text chat area. So if you do have any questions and you would like to participate, send your text to Josh, and he will interrupt us with your questions so that we can get those answered as well. All right? All right, so let's get started. Here is our iconic image for the ethics seminar. And as you can see in the trainer notes, what we're really trying to do here is to set a tone for the training. And so we say that, you know, trying to balance ethics is like walking a tightrope. You've got your personal business on the one hand, and you've got all of your obligations as an employee on the other hand. So the purpose of this training is to help you navigate through those kind of ethics pitfalls. Love that picture. Sorry, I'm just partial to the imagery. And then the goal of today's training, of course, you know, setting goals for participants is important. But the important thing here is that what we're going to do is set the expectation for participants that this is going to be a different training than the CETC. We definitely have a lot of people who come in here since we started this program this summer, and they're like, oh, this is going to suck. This is going to be the CETC. So did I just say that? I just said that. All right. So this is where we really start to set the tone that this is going to be different. We are going to provide an overview of the Code of Ethics. That's where we're going to be really focusing on, and the standards of conduct. We have a poster here. We are going to talk about some specifics, like outside activities and gifts and whatnot. But then these last two bullets, we're going to define our roles and responsibilities as state officers and employees. And this is where we get into a different kind of discussion than we ever did with the CETC. And we will expand on the integrity standards to foster a strong culture of ethical behavior in the public sector. So this program ends up on more of a big picture focus on issues in ethics rather than getting bogged down in the weeds of looking at taking a close examination of the ethics laws. Okay? So you'll see how that idea plays out throughout the materials. This is a big picture training. It's refresher. Want to talk about this one?
Yeah, let's do it. So we thought it was helpful because some of our agencies have more stricter training standards than we do. The law provides for us that we have to maintain refresher training every 3 years. However, many of our agencies do refresher training every single year, which is fantastic. So for those of our filers who haven't been in these seats in 3 years, we thought it would be helpful to provide them with just a quick overview of the major changes that have occurred since the last time they've taken the CETC. So for 2014 was a big year for JCOPE with respect to a lot of new regulations were issued. We had regulations for gifts for both our state officers and employees. I'm sure many of us are aware of that new analysis now, as well as new gift regulations for lobbyists and clients as well. We kind of carved out travel from our honoraria regulations, and we created the official activity expense payments, which some of you are aware of, our travel. And we launched the online ethics orientation. We always like to make it aware to brand new filers or those of us who are ethics officers that the online ethics orientation is the first of those 3 mandated trainings. Okay, so the online ethics orientation, as many of you are aware, is available on SLMS, and we just pretty much touch on where and how they are able to access that. In 2015, as many of us remember, the FDS question 8 blew up. It's a big question and dealt with the client disclosures in the FDS. We talked about our outside activity regulations and just give the filers a basic general idea of how we really define an outside activity regulation. Typically, we just give them a brief awareness that an outside activity is generally something that happens outside of your regular working hours, and it can pretty much involve anything, whether it's compensated or not, just to kind of give a good touch point for later on when we talk about outside activity regulations. And we talk about the new FDS online application and how filers now who file online are able to view and track their regular ongoing training requirements. And for those of you ethics officers who haven't been onto our new system, we've just launched back in Christmas week our training portal. We appreciate all of your tireless help in helping us identify and troubleshoot some of the bugs that we had early on in the system. But we also inform our filers that they'll be able to now monitor and track their ongoing refresher ethics training. And they'll also be receiving notifications if they are overdue in their training, as well as when an ethics officer goes in and enters in a training completion date, they'll also be notified automatically through the system, and they'll also be aware of when their next training due date is. In 2016, we touch upon how we were working on getting a new JCOPE website available, which is going to make things incredibly more user-friendly, and it's going to allow both of our officers and employees, as well as our lobbyists and clients, access to our information a lot more easily. So we hope to be able to have that launched sometime this year.
Yeah, so stay tuned for 2017. We've got a lot of initiatives underway, but we will be adjusting this slide periodically. This one will probably be updated soon to add a 2017 bullet, but it's good at least to give people a brief overview of what you may have missed while you were out on your 3-year lag of refresher training.
But also feel free to add some benchmarks that pertain to your agency. If there's anything specific that you want to highlight that's happened throughout the agency in your year, that's really your opportunity to kind of make this training your own. And we really do encourage that.
Good question.
Yep.
Will the seminar refresher online program be available to SUNY schools?
Will the seminar online program? Well, it's not an online training, so I would ask that inquirer to clarify. Unfortunately, according to Executive Law 94, both the CETC and the seminar are required to be live training. Now, because this is a population expressly of ethics officers and training delegates, I will explain that. Excuse me. For us as an agency, our attorneys have indicated that means that we really just do it live. But it has been translated as, at the very minimum, participants have to be given the opportunity to ask questions in real time, right? Now, in consideration of so many agencies that have staff that is distributed all over the state, we do allow agencies to conduct training via live online platforms such as WebEx, right? Now, the reason why we don't normally conduct training via WebEx, and the reason why WebEx participants today can't get CLE credit, is because we do not have a way that we as an agency, and we're holding ourselves to a slightly higher standard, we have to be able to accurately verify attendance. And it's difficult for us to do that via WebEx, right? So, but if you as an ethics officer can find a way that you feel comfortable adequately verifying attendance for your people, then we allow you to conduct both the CETC and the seminar via webinars. We just trust that you have procedures in place to be able to verify it. Okay, but we leave that problem up to you. So.
And we've had many agencies, what they typically do is, most of these larger agencies will have a room that can fit, this room here in Albany that can fit 20, 30 people. So typically what happens is that they'll WebEx to one central location, and typically the ethics officer or someone else will pretty much proctor that session. So that's been common practice throughout other agencies.
Sign-in sheet, everybody gets in a room and watches TV. So, but however you like to work, there's a dozen different ways you can make the technology work, as long as that that live component, ask questions in real time is honored, then not to show up. All right, actually, before I move on, so this is the first of our many transition slides. As far as the graphics are concerned, the font is different right now. We have this really fun chalkboard font, and so all of our backgrounds are chalkboards, and we had a problem with the font because it was a special font, so now it doesn't make as much sense. But can I just say, like, amongst ourselves, it was really clever and beautiful. And now, all right, but there you go. But our main point there is this slide was our transition slide. You'll see them throughout. And on this conflict of interest slide here, the main thing that we do here is introduce the concept that a conflict of interest does not have to be an actual conflict of interest. We think it's important to remind people that the optics test is a valid part of the law. And so you cannot even give the appearance of a conflict of interest. And that is important concept to lay down right up front, because when we are telling our participants to take the larger view of their conduct, and we say, pay attention to whether or not this is ethical, not whether or not it's legal, this is where you can start laying that groundwork there. Mm-hmm. You say, if something even gives the appearance of a conflict of interest, then it is prohibitive, it's presumptively prohibited behavior.
I typically train on Public Officers Law 74, and I always make sure to tell our filers that it really is the foundation behind all of the ethics laws. It's important for them to recognize that even for those individuals who are not subject to Public Officers Law 73, because they're either unpaid or they're per diem, that they're still bound by the rules of Public Officers Law 74. So it's always important to kind of get them aware of that concept. But even when we're talking about gifts, honoraria, official activity expenses, the analysis is always the same. At the very end, we're always going to have to circle back and recognize whether or not there could be a potential conflict of interest. And we always let people know that they should just judge their specific set of circumstances or their situation and really examine that through the lens of the public. And with somebody on the outside construe that what they're trying to participate in may be a conflict of interest with their between their personal job and their state service. So that's where we always try to bring in that tie-in.
Good to...
Yeah, just as a reminder for everyone to mute their phones. There seems to be a bit of a background.
Yeah, so please mute your phones, WebEx folks. I know. But just speaking of mute, Buffalo and New York City for our video conference, if you do have a question, you can unmute your microphone and ask because you don't have text chat. All right.
So here, unlike the CETC, for those of us who remember the CETC and train it often, it's very dense, right? This part of it is incredibly dense. We take you through all of the standards, and we give you examples, and it's very heavy. So what we've decided to do here is because we figure most individuals aren't going to remember each and every citation of the law, but what they will remember are concepts, right? So here we've kind of taken away a lot of the dense stuff in the CETC, and we've just focused it into concepts. So what we typically do is we'll talk about how Standard A deals with impartiality, really maintaining an independence of judgment when performing your state job, and that's pretty much where we end it. We do encourage you guys, when you go back, if you have specific examples within your agency that often come up that are typical conflicts of interest that come up in your agency that align with any of these standards, feel free to use those. It's always helpful that we've noticed, now that we've launched this brand new training, people have become really receptive to our real-world examples. So it's always helpful wherever you can to bring those into your training. B and C, we always talk about, it's about disclosing confidential information, right? And making sure that we're not disclosing confidential information that you've gained because of who you are in your position here within the state, as well as making sure that you're not disclosing that confidential information to either benefit yourself or someone else. Standard D, here we talk about securing privileges or favors based on your state job. That standard will get a little bit more interesting as we move on within the presentation. And we also let them know that it's about stewardship of state resources, making sure that we're utilizing the resources of the state, whether that be state time, state property, printers, faxes, computers for state business only, and that we're not utilizing the state property for our own personal usage. Standard I really impacts a small number of people, so it's just a touch for us. We talk about business with the state and making sure that if you're a full-time state officer and employee, that you're not contracting for work, right? That you're not trying to provide goods or services to entities that are regulated or licensed by your agency. On F&H, we talk a lot about throughout the presentation. We call these our integrity standards. Just for all of you to be aware of, there really is no civil penalty associated with the integrity standards. However, we've followed a pattern that for most individuals who have been found guilty of violating one of these standards, typically they're also found in violations of F&H, and their agency can pose stricter disciplinary action on them if they're found in violations of F&H. Typically, separation of state service is what we've seen in that. And here we're talking about misconduct when we're talking about the integrity standards, making sure that it's not going to appear to someone on the outside that we're engaged in some form of misconduct. Typically what we do is we also announce that JCOPE does have a report misconduct initiative. We have a website, report misconduct on ny.gov, as well as a 1-800-87 ethics number, where both state officers and employees, interested members of the public, as well as our lobbyists and clients can call us anonymously and give us tips about potential alleged violations. So it's important that these filers do realize that that is how we become aware of these alleged violations, that we have other people that give us a call on that anonymous line. And lastly, we focus on financial conflicts of interest and what that might look like. A lot of it is making sure that we're abstaining from personal investments that may conflict with our state job. And we always touch upon that typically your financial disclosure statement, filling out that financial disclosure statement is a really key benchmark in helping both the filer, the ethics officer, and the agency try to discover and uncover any potential conflicts of interest there. And as anything, there always are consequences. So it can result in a civil penalty of up to $10,000, including the value of any benefit, gift, or compensation received.
Now, we don't necessarily beat this slide step, but we do think it's important that people know what the consequences are. But this is also a good place that if we haven't already, we introduce the concept of, your agency may impose additional penalties above and beyond. Agencies can impose consequences on their staff for violating any of these statutes, even without JCOPE involvement. So if you have somebody who's engaging in misconduct, violating one of the integrity standards, agencies can and have fired people, and we had nothing to do with that. That has nothing to do with our consequences here that are in the statutory law. So this is a good place to also mention that if you do know that your agency has strict policies about X, Y, or Z, to mention it here. And then this slide happens, right? So this is why we really needed to train the trainer, because if we just handed you a deck of slides and then this slide came up, if you're used to just reading the slides to your staff and then clicking next, what do you do with this? So what this is our first invitation to participants to get more involved. So what we want to do is well, I'm a little bit of a goof when I'm training, so I make it a little bit like a game show. Let's play What's That Violation, or something like that. What we're doing here is we're trying to wake them up, because at this point we're only a few slides in, they're already half asleep. We get that, right? So here's the question. We're like, all right, we've just reviewed all of these standards of conduct here. So either referring to the standards of conduct in your plain language guide on page 14, or if you like us to have it on a fancy poster, you say, all right, well, what do you think? Which of those standards do you think has resulted in the most enforcement actions by JCOPE? So let's get them thinking a little bit, right? As soon as you get people who have to do an action, they're immediately more engaged in the presentation. So this makes it a little bit easier for you as an ethics officer, because people feel a little bit better about the training after it's over. So we give them some options. Is it impartiality, which is standard A, securing privileges or favors based on state job, confidentiality, misconduct. This next slide here is because one of the things that we like to do is, so it's the same answers. I'm just backing up the slide. Here's the question with the answers, and then the next slide has the answers again. Keep calm and raise your hand, and that's because on this slide what we do is I invite people to participate. I say, okay, I'm going to ask you to vote. You can vote more than once, but show of hands, how many people think that impartiality is the area that most violations happen? So impartiality, right? People are playing favorites. So anybody can think, seriously, play along. Is there anybody here who thinks that impartiality is where we see the most violations? All right, I don't see any hands. So we can't do it right now because we have WebEx, but what we do is we use the little ink drawer. I use a mouse, and I would write 0 next to impartiality. This is the chalkboard effect here. How about securing privileges or favors based on your state job? How many people think that that might be a violation? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just like scan the room and make up a number. So let's say 5 people there, confidentiality. I go through them all. I get people to raise their hand, and I get them to raise their hand. I mean, if people are reluctant, I'm like, come on, this is your training, right? And then we put the answers down on the board, and we're like, all right, so let's see whether crowdsourcing an answer is right. Gets them to buy in. Now they want to know. Now they want to know the answer. So this is a little bit more interactive than just like droning on in lecture. So the answer is 2. This is standard D, securing privileges or favors based on your state job. By far, this is the area where we see the most violations occur. And so this is where we're going to shift gears in this training. We're going to start moving into really giving some good examples of what violations of standard D look like for people. And this is where it gets fun. So we give them the actual legal statute. I don't usually read it to them verbatim. But I do sometimes paraphrase it. But the key here when you're looking at the statute, this is one of the few times you're going to see statutory language on a slide. But since this is where we see the most violations, this is one that we felt like it was worth putting it up there. But standard D really does have 2 parts. It's both securing unwanted privileges for yourself based on who you are, being Grand Poobah in the state. But the second part of it is also that misappropriation or misuse of state resources. So I think the reason why this standard gets the most violations is that there's 2 different ways that you could actually violate that one. So that's why we put the statute up there, and that's the focal point of this particular one. There's 2 different ways that you can run afoul of them. Now this is where we change tack. Now I've got a segue here when I was talking about going from the law. Every time a state officer or employee violates standard D, they're chipping away at the public trust. And that is a segue that leads here because we're going to be talking about integrity and ethics. And those are, for many people, subjective, squishy terms. And so it's a good thing up front, before we wade too deeply into that subjective territory, it's a good idea to just start by saying, what are we talking about here? What do we mean by integrity? So choosing your thoughts and actions based on your values rather than personal gain. And there we get back to the tightrope walker, right? Your professional obligations versus your own personal gain. And that's what we mean about integrity there. So we set that as a premise, and then we launch into our real-world examples that illustrate violations of standard D. So we have the case of the fallen tree. Again, we're just trying to be a little bit playful, but we did take all of the examples from this training program. We did take them straight from our real-life case files and various violation actions that have been taken against various people, which is really compelling. People like that. So the case of the fallen tree. We give a little background.
We do. We give a little background on the actual tree slide. We typically just let people know, many of us remember back in the fall of 2012 how Hurricane Sandy really devastated the East Coast. And then we just touch upon the fact that, tensions were really high in the communities where, the hurricane hit, but also government resources were incredibly strained at that time. And then we let them know that we're going to take a look at a real example of someone who was found in violation of standard D and what that looks like. Because we want to take away the misconception that a lot of these ethical violations are happening at the very top levels of government. We want to make it more relatable to other individuals who may not be aware that maybe some of their actions could potentially lead them to an ethics violation. So, and then we just take them right through the bullet points. So following Hurricane Sandy, we talk about how a director of an agency who's a policymaker, an FDS filer, again, getting that buy-in, getting that tie-in, diverted his crisis recovery workers, right, from being able to clear roads and pathways to really help these first emergency responders get to the people and to the resources that they needed. And instead, this director ended up having his team clear a tree that had fallen across the driveway of his Long Island home, right? And then we talk about how this situation actually became viral. It was a news story that blew up everywhere. It was on how many different networks?
It was definitely on the national news. The story went national. He was a director of FEMA. He was the head of the state emergency management unit. And you can Google this and you can find out about it. We don't include names here because we don't need to, but this is definitely Googleable because Google lasts forever. And that is one of the points that we make is that once you have a violation that lands you in the paper, that has its own consequence because these things follow you. So, but this is a good example to start with because it is so egregious. Everybody can read this example, and it's crystal clear that this was wrong behavior. Everybody can see this example and be kind of outraged. It was outrageous enough that the national news picked it up and ran with it for quite a while. So what do we think happened to this guy? Again, it's going to be in the same format, trying to get buy-in. Here are their choices. Make jokes about them if you can. Play them up. And then the same choices are on the follow-up slides so that we can write on the slides. You can do that or you don't have to if you want, but we have the raise your hand logo there in the corner, and that's to encourage that participation is allowed and expected here. So we do the same thing. Well, what do you think, folks? Do you think that he lost his job? You can vote more than once. Come on, raise your hands. Do you think he paid a fine? Was he just written up? Was that a slap on the wrist? Do you think all of the above happened? You get them to commit to an answer. And it doesn't really matter, right? You ever see that show, Whose Line Is It Anyway? The points don't really matter. Points don't matter. It's to get them to, contribute and participate and think. You have to think enough to choose a response, and then all of a sudden you're immediately vested in finding out the answer. So the correct answer here was, of course, all of the above. The book was thrown at him. We have it in the notes as well, what some of the consequences are. But this slide here, things to consider. This slide is the first time it appears, but it's going to come up again and again. What we're also trying to do with this training is to teach critical thinking skills on topics of ethics. So this slide here and the slides that follow give some examples of, well, how should we be thinking of these situations? Some of the questions that we pose on the slides are purely hypothetical or theoretical questions. They're designed just to get you to think about them. The answers may be obvious, but we pose the questions to model the kind of thinking that we need to engage in when we find ourselves in a situation where we're not really sure which way to go. So that's what these things to consider slides are all about, is to try to inspire or prompt critical thinking.
And here specifically, we're really helping them address the domino effect that happens, right? So we want to let them know that once a phone call is made, once we become aware of a situation, once an investigation is conducted, once an enforcement action has been presented, what happens after that, and that's when we really get into Google lasts forever, and we want to let them know that, a press release gets issued here, and what happens after that? These major media news outlets pick up the story. Now all of a sudden this individual's name, their agency, all of this information within that press release and within that news story that later on gets picked up, and that this affects not only the individual that has the violation, but it affects the agency and everyone else and every one of their colleagues, as well as their family and community relationships, just trying to get that whole big picture, as Kate mentioned.
And then we always offer the consequences. People always want to know how the story ends. And that's, I think, an important thing to keep in mind as you're presenting these examples. Tell a story. It's one of the most effective ways of communicating. If you can get them to kind of follow along that this is a story, everybody wants to know how the story ends then. So make sure you follow up with the consequences. This director, he did face disciplinary action. He lost his job. He was fined. He was publicly fired by Governor Cuomo. I think he was publicly fired in like a press conference. I mean, it was such a storm of controversy because Sandy was still ongoing and emergency crews. I mean, this was immediately noticed. It happened while the Sandy cleanup was still really sore and hot for a lot of people. People weren't even back in their homes yet, and this became known, and so it was an immediate crisis that the governor had to take care of. Yeah, so that guy, I hope that tree service was worth it for him. So then we move into another example. Now we're still using these examples to to showcase Standard D and the ways people violate Standard D. So we have another one. It's a family affair. And this is about a high-ranking person from MTA who wants to find his son a job at his agency. Now, what I point out here is that intentions can be one thing, but how you follow up on them are quite another thing. It can seem quite natural to want to try to help your child get a job. And there are legitimate and okay ways that you can provide some sort of assistance, but you have to be very cautious because otherwise you can inadvertently violate. So we use this as an example to show that, you don't have to be some mustache-twirling Lothario who is out to commit ethics violations, insert evil chuckle here, that, quite often these violations are inadvertent. And so the point of training is to make you aware enough of the kinds of things that you need to be on the lookout for so that you don't accidentally violate some of these standards. And I think that's important too, because a lot of times you have participants in here who says, well, I'm a good person, I'm not going to ever need this. And it's not about being a good person. It's not about having bad intentions. It's about having the lack of knowledge that you need in order to successfully navigate through these kind of ethical situations. So he asks his subordinates to guide his son through the employment process at work. His son gets a job at the agency. All right, so here's our things to consider slide. So again, now we're going to start modeling the kind of thinking that we need to process through this. So on the face of it, does this look ethical? How would this is where we bring it back to the public. How would it look to the public that some high-ranking anybody at an agency, now all of a sudden their son or child got a job at an agency? Would it look good? Probably not, right? So it automatically doesn't pass that first test. Does it violate the standards of conduct? We've just spent quite a bit of time reviewing the standards of conduct. So this is a chance to try to draw them out a little bit. Look at page 14 in your plain language guide. What do you think? Do you think he violated any of the standards? Now, on the other hand, we're also using this as an example of a violation of Standard D. So you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time on that unless you think your folks need it. Any other ethics laws that may have been violated? This is where I lead them to the nepotism question, right? We haven't mentioned nepotism in this example yet. If nobody has mentioned it before, then question 3 is where I raise nepotism as a topic. And what consequences may this employee face? Ooh, what could happen to this guy? Everybody wants to know. So we bring you straight to the consequences. There was an investigation. This guy was forced to retire. He lost all his vacation days. His son got canned. And this guy also received a civil penalty of $1,500 from us. So this is a good slide that shows that the consequences were both JCOPE-imposed consequences as well as agency-imposed consequences, and that is very typical. So people need to know that it's not just JCOPE. Our reach and our penalties are actually, they can be severe, but they're also limited. Quite often agencies have more of an opportunity to be flexible in their consequences to people.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure. Question on the floor.
Is that all he did to get that ramification?
He directed his subordinates to guide his son through that whole employment process. But yeah, that was it.
Just a normal question I would get.
Yeah, my understanding is, yeah, it was no more than that. But think about the reasons why that's such a problem. If you're a high-ranking anybody and you're directing your subordinates.
That's the difference. That's for the lawyers in the room.
True.
Because here it says that he asked.
Okay, so you're.
And many of my offices, my subordinates are my friends, so if they said, hey, we'll help you out with this, just like somebody in the fire department, police department.
Right. So for the purposes of our microphones here, he's pointing out that in the trainer notes, and I take responsibility for the trainer notes, and I'm not an attorney, so sometimes I'm a little loose with my language. But he pointed out that in the trainer notes it says that this official asked his subordinates to help. So what we're looking at here, and the reason why it's a violation, was this wasn't just a casual ask. He's directing his subordinates to help guide his son through the process. And not only is that securing unwarranted favors, but it could also be looked at as, in putting undue pressure on your subordinates to engage in unethical behavior as well. So thank you for pointing that out. Maybe I should change it from ask to directed. See, I'm not an attorney. I just played one on the training floor. All right, now, before we move on past Standard D, we end with a few additional examples that are very common examples of ways that people have, with good intentions, but inadvertently violated. You know, using agency letterhead, that's a big one. I know lots of agencies deal with that one. Using your official position to receive discounts, free services that aren't available to the general public. We usually use here, if you have a cell phone, if you have a cell phone plan, you get a discount because you're a state employee. That's not what we're talking about here. It's offered to all state employees, so keep your, 19% Verizon discount or AT&T. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, you manage your DOT and you manage a work crew who's repaving a bridge, and you'd redirect them to give you a little bit of free sidewalk repaving at your house just as a little thank you. Which has happened. This has been a real example, right? So you can't receive discounts or free services that aren't generally available to others, right?
And you can't direct them to other people either.
And you cannot redirect gifts to other people as well. Exactly.
Not even to a charity.
But here's where that MTA example comes in. You can't use your official position to force or intimidate somebody. So the difference between asking and directing a subordinate to guide somebody through the employment process is directing, because it was a violation of the third bullet here. All right. And then any last questions about violations of Standard D? All right, well, now let's move into some other areas of ethics laws where people frequently have questions or often get things wrong. And the first is the area of outside activities. Outside activities, we just give that quick definition. These are things that, job-like tasks that you have that are outside of your state employment.
And generally, I like to crowdsource. So I will ask, out of everyone in the audience, how many of us are policymakers, right? And then we'll get a show of hands as to the individuals who are policymakers, and then we'll talk about how the regulations really apply to policymakers and how there's a special approval process for you in order to be able to do your outside activity. So we just want to give them a general awareness that the regulations really speak to those of us who are designated as policymakers. But here we give a general awareness of what outside activities are. Any interest or activity not related to your state employment, it occurs outside of your regular working hours, and you're not utilizing any of the resources of the state to be able to conduct your outside activity. So this graphic kind of illustrates it can be anything, really. It can be paid, unpaid, it can be volunteer, and we just basically note that it can be anything from serving as an adjunct professor to being a part-time salesperson to a real estate agent to an outside activity of being a local fitness instructor.
All right, so things to consider. Again, you'll see these types of slides repeat, but just these are things that they should be aware of when it comes to these outside activities. This is where we urge them to please contact your agency ethics officer. And that's primarily because you know the kinds of conflicts that will be unique to your agency best. JCOPE, the attorney of the day, they are more than happy to talk to your agency staff level, your staff, about outside activities, but really their first line for something like an outside activity should be the agency ethics officer. There is, and then we inform them, there is an approval process before they engage in the activity. Don't start that activity and then retroactively seek approval. And there's additional restrictions for people who want to do business with the state. As a state employee, that's a problem. So here's our what's new slide. Again, this is sort of like the slide in the beginning where we're just telling people what's been new since like the last 3 years. So if people haven't seen any of this material in a while, just give them a little reminder. The compensation threshold increased by 1,000. You can't lobby lawmakers, and you have to notify your EO on an ongoing basis if you are continuing to engage in an outside activity. And that does represent a change because it used to be that all you needed was to get the approval once, and then you could continue on that activity for years and years without ever reaching back to your agency. You don't need to as ethics officers, you don't need to reapprove the activity each year. but your staff should be notifying you that they are continuing to engage in that activity. And that gives you as an ethics officer an opportunity to, at least once a year, to continue to review and assess whether or not that activity is still appropriate in light of changing circumstances. So that statutory change was there to help make ethics officers' lives a little bit easier as far as monitoring the outside activities of your staff. Now, this I usually just go directly to. You can find this on page 19. If you are a policymaker and outside activities apply to you, please know that there is an approval form that you need. There's a lot of words on this slide. They are too small for most people to read. I certainly wouldn't encourage you to read it all to them, not when it's already there in their plain language guide, but this is there to just show them visually, wow, there's an approval process and it's complicated. So please, if this applies to you, speak to me after the training, or please look up on page 19 to see what kind of approvals you may need for your activity.
And this comes right out of our outside activity regulations too. And I think it also allows your filers a really good opportunity to determine whether they have to just come to you as the agency ethics officer for approval, or if they have to take that extra step, come to you first, get your approval, and then later come to us.
Okay. So don't read this to people. Oh, that would be horrible, right? Too much. All right, so here's another one of our transition slides. We just finished talking about outside activities, and so now we're going to say, all right, so let's show you how, just like we did with Standard D, here's what the standard is, and here's how people have screwed it up. That's what this transition slide does here. Now that we've talked about outside activities, let's show you where some conflicts of interest have arisen in that. And so we do just like we did before. We're going to start with giving a case example. This one ended up with a system-wide ethics failure. And the summary here, I won't read it all to you, but there's a professor who submits a sole source memorandum to purchase a specialized software, and he goes through the appropriate procurement process, and it works. He gets to purchase the specialized software for $4,500. So I read through this, I summarize it, and I go, all right, so far so good. This does not seem bad so far, very intentionally, because at this point, they're looking for the things that are wrong. So, right, well, this is good. We want them to stay awake, right? So I read through, well, all right, well, what's wrong with this scenario then? And it's the next slide that gets gasped. People go, oh, because it turns out that the professor happened to be the owner of that software company, and he was scamming the procurement process. His software company had never even had a sale before, so he had to open up a P.O. box just before in order to receive this payment. Right, so like it looked good on the surface, but as soon as there was an investigation, this whole this whole house of cards came tumbling down. So people love this one. They're like, oh, I can't believe that. Right. So here we move right into our things to consider. All right. Well, let's think about this one. And for sure, these questions are posed hypothetically. Were the actions of this person ethical? Everybody's going to go, oh.
We do a thumbs up, thumbs down.
Yeah, you're right. What steps should the professor have taken? Well, I mean, you don't really have to ask them this question. You can answer it. It's like, well, they should have just followed the normal procurement process, right? That's what should have happened. Which standards of conduct do you think were violated, though? And this is where we have fun. Because if you have them look at page 14 with that standard of conduct list, but this is why actually we printed a poster. I don't know if you're WebEx and video conferences, we put it on a poster because we like visuals. And so we're like, all right, can we get a standard A, impartiality? Do you think he violated that? How about standards B and C, disclosing confidential information? We can go down the list, and people like to vote on which standards they think may have been violated. Now, what other ethics laws may have been violated here? This is where we just briefly introduce the notion that there are other ethics laws outside of the standards of conduct, and several of them include financial conflicts of interest. I do it just as a brief mention there, because when we get to the next slide, well, what were the consequences here? Well, it was the financial conflicts in 73. The standards of conduct are in Public Officers Law 74. So he actually got found guilty of violating 73, which had a higher penalty. That's why they went after that financial conflict of interest there. So he paid a fine of $20,000. He had to make full restitution. So people want to know on this one, well, was he fired? Now, I will point out that this was a professor at one of our state university system schools, and tenure laws can be very tricky to negotiate. So we don't know for sure whether or not this professor was fired as a result of this, but we can tell you we did look on the faculty rolls for the following year, and he did not appear on the faculty roll the following year. So we can't 100% confirm that he was fired, but he was no longer an active faculty member at least. So this one got him good too. All right, we just double checked. Do you have any last questions on outside activities? Then we move into gifts. This is the next part of the law that we're going to talk about. First, we get to define a gift. I love this graphic. Talk about taking a complicated subject and breaking it down into an easy-to-digest formula. It's simple. Anything of value less than $15 is not considered a gift. Cool. Start with the basic definition, right? And that works out. Because then what I do is I draw their attention to page 23 of their plain language guide, which gives the entire list of allowable gifts. Now, this graphic really does need explanation. So if you are watching a recorded version of this at home for WebEx, this is the part where you pay attention, okay? Because this graphic will not make sense to you unless you know the secret sauce here. There is a whole list of allowable gifts. We call them our non-gift gifts, right? And some of the pictures here follow along some of those bullet points. Awards, specialty awards, they're not counted as a gift. Discounts, this is that like 20% cell phone discount, that makes sense. Honorary degrees, that's not considered a gift. The lower left, the pens, yeah, you know, you go to a conference, you get the pens, you get the flag, the little squeeze balls, the mugs with the company logo on them. Those are not considered gifts. But then you see this image of somebody handing out a wad of cash. Oh, you mean a wad of cash? That's not a gift. I can take that? No. You have to be really clear to that. People who are paying attention at this point are going to see that wad of cash, and they're going to be wondering, what the heck is going on? So if you're training this, you have to be prepared to address the wad of cash. That is an image that is designed to get people's attention so that you can debunk it. No, you may not accept cash. What this image is there is that one of the gift exceptions is political contributions. All right? So if you see the flag in the background, the guy's wearing a red power tie, that's what that image is all about, is political contributions are not considered a gift under the law. But there's a couple of things that are notable that are also not on this slide. So,
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah.
We just interrupt for just a second. We had also, when we were doing this recently, we had a question from somebody. They said, oh, pens, but, you know, one of our employees went to a widely attended event, and they itemized everything, and actually the pens were $25 that they were, God knows what kind of pens they were giving out. But, so that might be a point you might want to throw in there, too. But always, you know, say, particularly, like, for example, the comptroller's office, we have people traveling all the time to conferences and whatnot, but sometimes you may need to look into it a little more, depending on what it is. I just wanted to bring that up.
some conference swag may be swaggier than others. Okay. But in your trainer notes, you'll see a couple of other things that are not pictured here, but are worth verbally mentioning, and that is gifts from family or friends, right? If there's a pre-existing relationship of gifting, that might be an exception. Oh, might be's and maybes surround that, that exclusion. Meals at professional programs are generally acceptable as well. And we don't, I mean, we couldn't put a graphic on the slide for every single item on that list, but that's the point of the slide. This is a point where you can pause, have them go into their plain language guide, look at the allowable gifts. If you know that there are particular things that are an issue at your age, say this is a good time to mention it. Oops. All right. So that brings us, that whole food at a widely attended event, that brings us to the next topic of conversation. And this is one of those common gift exclusions here, the widely attended events. So we do spend a little bit of time talking about this because this is one where people get frequently confused about what's allowable and what's not. Now, there are a lot of There are a lot of words on this slide, and hopefully you can see that so far we've really made an effort to reduce the number of words on a slide. But widely attended events are one of those areas where people get very confused, and we figure that this is a good time to just like sketch out for people and remind them that you have to satisfy a few conditions before you qualify. So we've got the 4 conditions there. Now, how you decide to review them, we offer you discretion about that. You know, it depends on, you know your population, you know whether or not this is an issue that is common to you or maybe not so common. So maybe you're going to spend a lot of time making sure that folks understand this. Maybe this is a mention depending on your population. But we did put all 4 of those exclusions, bless you, we put all of those criteria on the board so that you can have an opportunity to talk about it with your folks.
I will say that steps 1 and 2, from our experience, are the steps that typically people have the most questions about. I normally break down, I call them hurdles. Kate calls them conditions, I call them hurdles that you have to pass. Complimentary admission must be offered by the sponsor of the event. So I always just give a quick example, and that being that, let's say Staples is holding a widely attended event and they invite you to the widely attended event. Then you've satisfied that first condition. Staples' name is on the complimentary admission ticket. They're offering it to you. It doesn't mean that you can go. It just means that you satisfy step 1. And then I give them the alternate that, let's say Xerox purchases an entire table at Staples' widely attended event. Now, Xerox offers you a ticket. Now, that's an example of something that would not satisfy that first condition. So typically, that's the areas that we get a lot of confusion on. And people often ask us about step 2, how am I supposed to know if 25 individuals that are not from my agency are invited to this event? How am I supposed to know that as a filer? So we typically always advise them, go to your ethics officer. They're going to have to go to you anyway to get that final approval, and that with your ethics officer and with us, we will be able to kind of secure that guest list for you. You know, the attorneys here at JCOPE as well as your ethics officers will be willing to kind of tie that bridge together and make sure that 25 individuals not from your agency are invited to that widely attended event. Because obviously, it's always going to be a question for your filers, well, how are we supposed to know this even qualifies? So those are the 2 areas that we get the most questions on.
All right. So a couple of other places where these are considered gift exclusions, but these are more of a mention. If you're going to a bona fide political event or a bona fide charitable event, and bona fide in this case is roughly defined as it has to be providing, the purpose of the event has to be to provide financial support either for the political event that it's being held for or for the charity. Right? So, but if it's a political event or a charitable event, then those are also exclusions to the gift rules. You can attend those events. And then, for people who are graphic, I love this graphic. Thank you, Marlena. This helps. Again, we're trying to also foster the kind of critical thinking skills around these topics, right? So this helps break it down. Somebody offers you a gift, and here's the thing, and I mentioned this to staff. We are all human beings, and we all like nice things. And when you are in the moment and somebody offers you something nice, it is human nature to want to be able to say yes to that thing. And social politeness makes refusal of certain kinds of gifts difficult. So in order to prepare yourself, you need to know how to think about gifts before you're in that moment. So this graphic helps to show you what kind of thinking you need to engage in before you can decide whether or not you can accept that nice thing that somebody offered you. So you have to do an analysis. And the first question is, well, first of all, is it even a gift? Right? We've just finished going over the allowable non-gift gifts. So that's the first thing. It's like, well, is this a gift or is this an allowable thing? So does it fall under any of those exclusions? And then the next point is the important point. Is that gift offered by an interested source? And we say we're going to clarify that definition in just a moment, because ultimately that last box there, what we're always looking for in any of these gift analyses is we're looking to see whether or not it could even give the appearance that the receipt of this thing of value could be intended to influence you or reward you in some way. Because if the answer is yes to that question, then no, you can't take that nice thing. So then we move into defining an interested source. Now, we put the full list here. This is another one of those exceptions where we have a lot of words on the page, but I don't read it all. I mean, it's there so that if you want to cherry pick one or two of them that may be particularly relevant to your agency, you may do so. But what I usually do is I summarize this entire slide that says an interested source could be any one of these things, but basically it is anyone who may have a vested interest in trying to influence you. And that's the best abbreviated definition of an interested source that I can give. So once we've gotten clear on what an interested source is, oh, sorry, we got a question?
I have a hypothetical question.
All right, a hypothetical question.
So
lay it on me.
Engineering firm that does work for your agency offers you a spot in the golf course on a tournament for a charity. Then you attend this charitable event.
Okay, so it's a charitable event that includes golf, right? The way it works is, and the way the regulations read, you cannot engage in any of the recreational extracurriculars that may be associated with that conference. So, yeah,
It's not a conference.
is that a conference?
They were saying charitable event.
Well, if it's a charitable event,
We've had this question.
if it's a charitable event, it's allowable regardless of what activities are there.
We've also had this.
Come on up. All right, come on, the attorney here. Remember, I didn't play well on the training floor.
I might get, if you all are interested in that question, I want to make sure this is what we said. Our prior director of ethics, in one of the ethics reviews, there was a question similar to this. That's our newsletter. And I think at first he said, yeah, that's usually going to be fine. But I want to say, and then later, back in November, we had an ethics forum where he said, you know, mea culpa, I wanted to also say, though, you always have to do the 74 analysis. So he meant to put that into that newsletter, that on the surface it might be okay, but depending. So you always have to do the 74. If there's some sort of circumstance that might not make that allowable, I mean, it very well could be that there's something going on with that charity and your agency. I can't, you know, put through all the circumstances right now what that scenario might be, but
But you raise a really important point. We're not going to address a lot of hypotheticals here. We want to stay focused on this. But one of the things that we say throughout this, and I urge you and encourage you to likewise adopt, is even if you are an attorney and you're an ethics officer, you don't have to be the sage on the stage. You don't have to have every answer on the training floor, right? What you do need to do is empower your participants to know where and how to find their answers. And we are, as an agency, we are more than happy to serve as that information resource and referral source. So we say throughout this training course, when Marlene and I are training, you know, if you have any questions about this, call us. We have an Attorney of the Day program. It's confidential. Any of your staff can bypass you as an ethics officer, come straight to the attorney. It's confidential advice and guidance. You, as well as ethics officers, you're also free to call the Attorney of the Day program and get your questions answered. So right in the immediate moment of the training, and we try to answer the questions that you have, right? Make people feel welcome. But there's so much of ethics laws is situational. And so you're going to have participants that are going to raise their particular narrow set of circumstances, which may end up serving to confuse or complicate other participants, right? So where you can answer questions, but where in your judgment a situation is posed by a participant that is best addressed privately because it's really related to their particular set of circumstances, we invite you to defer, create a parking lot if you need to, or if you're not even sure of the answer, just say, you know, that would be a really good one for the JCOPE attorneys. They get together and they bash these questions around and come up. Reasonable people can disagree on some of these aspects of ethics laws, and JCOPE attorneys will be happy to provide you cover with any of the answers that you're providing to them. So there you go. There's that little slide. All right. So the gift analysis here. And again, this is just a second opportunity to kind of walk them through the kind of thinking that they need to engage in. You first ask, is the item valued at $15 or less? If yes, then it can be ordinarily accepted with all of the conditions. Unless it looks like it might be compromised, but generally speaking, if it's less than $15, yes. No, if it doesn't, or if it's not a gift exclusion, then the second question is, does it come from an interested source? Yes or no? If it does come from an interested source, then the answer is no. You can't take it from an interested source. So this is just another way. I think we also have this graphic, yes, on page 25 of the plain language guide. Some people are really visual, and something like this will make that concept click where, you know, an hour of gabbing at them really goes right over their head. So wherever possible, refer them to graphics. Yes, sir, we got another question?
You may cover this, but a lot of times the campuses will have raffles, business card in, and the gift could be maybe an iPad or something.
Yeah,
Value.
we have had that question before, but I can't remember what the attorneys answered. The question was, you know, when you go to a conference, sometimes they have raffles where you chuck in your business card and you get something really sweet. I honestly, I know that has come up before. That is a question, but I don't have the answer for you. And especially since we're recording this for future use, I would hesitate to provide an answer that I'm not sure of. Another question?
No, I was going to say that I thought those were generally
A participant says that she believes that they're generally acceptable. I would be leaning on that direction. I just want to be abundantly cautious to not provide an answer that you're going to, like, advise other people on, because if I'm wrong, I don't want to, you know, steer you wrong. Yes, question?
Sorry, I hope this isn't a stupid question, but, I mean, if the complimentary attendance is a sort of gift, I mean, would you be able to cure other problems just by paying the attendance fee?
Yeah, it's no longer a gift once you pay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe worst case scenario, they can.
Yes, if somebody really wants to go do something that does not meet the exclusion parameters, yes, they can remedy that conflict of interest by paying. Because if the attendance, if the free attendance is what gives the appearance that they could be influenced, then paying for it does usually remedy that. All right, so now here's another transition slide. Now that we've done talking about gifts and defining it, and now we're going to say, all right, well, let's see where some people got in trouble with gifts. So once again, we're switching directly into providing a case example, and we give it a clever, punchy name. Are you on the hook or in the clear? Play along at home, folks. Is there ever such thing as free lunch? So here is
we call it the sports flag example. Truthfully, this is the example that I regret putting into the training program the most, because this is the area, for some reason, this is the example that gets people so upset during our training classes. Sometimes we've been derailed by up to 15 minutes just on this example. Be mindful of that. I don't have no idea why, but it's
I got ways around it. I got ways around it.
It is kind of sad, and we always feel bad for this person. Now,
Which is why people want a loophole for this. They feel bad for this person. All right.
So the overview here is that here we have an individual that works for one of our SUNY campuses, and here they're a clerk, right? So they're not a FDS filer, they're not a policy maker, they're not above that executive level. Here we just have a rank and file individual that works for SUNY, and his job basically is to just manage sporting equipment, okay? And from time to time, he is gifted with sports apparel, anything from T-shirts to signed jerseys, sweatshirts, warm-up gear, things of that nature, to sporting event tickets, to university games, and he often receives cash tips as a thank you, right, for doing their job. In total, throughout a given period of time, this wasn't all in just one season, over a couple of years, it amounted to over $4,600 worth of what we call sports swag.
And we say it in the trainer notes, this was one of the SUNYs that was hosting an NFL camp. So when we're talking about sports apparel and jerseys, we're talking about like an NFL player will sign his name on the back of the jersey and toss it to this guy and say, here, you know, great job. Which we love this story. Like, wouldn't you love to be like working in the locker room? Well, let's see, this is where it goes wrong. Because then we give them the things to consider, right? These are the things that they have to be reminded of. And the big one is, as a state employee, you can't get a gift that is intended to reward you for what you're already getting a paycheck for. And the other way that we can help people feel a little bit better about this example is look, the reason why we include this example is because all of our previous examples were talking about kind of high-ranking people, but we are all held to these same standards. And if you are a state employee and you are getting a paycheck, you are a public servant and you are held to a higher standard. And it doesn't matter. You do not have to be an executive. You do not have to be somebody, who's really high-ranking in your agency in order to inadvertently. This is a great example of inadvertent. This guy wasn't, he had no ill will. He wasn't doing anything wrong, right? But this is why training is important, so that you can be aware of these situations and not run afoul of this kind of thing. So, yeah, there is a hefty penalty for violations of the gift ban, but the consequences, this is where you kind of talk them down a little bit. Chill out. He did have to pay a fine. He basically had to pay restitution for the value of the gift that he received. He didn't lose his job. There was no additional consequences, but he did get a very expensive lesson in gift regulations. So, there's that. So, if he gets really upset at you about this example, you can refer them to us, and we'll talk them down off the cliff.
You can blame me.
All right. So then we move on to official activity expense payments. This is where things actually speed up. These become more mentions, more FYIs, reminders, refreshers. So let's talk about official activity expense payments. Remind your long-term employees this is formerly known as travel reimbursements. It got renamed. I'd like to give a little bit of an example. Maybe as part of your state job, you get invited to deliver a speech at a conference down in Washington, D.C., and the conference organizers have offered to pay for your travel and lodging because you have agreed to come give a speech. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. That's what these travel reimbursements are. But the main two things to consider is the travel still has to fall within your agency's travel guidelines, because if somebody is getting a first-class ticket down to Washington, D.C., that starts to violate the optics test. That starts to look bad, right? And we also have to do the same kind of analysis that we did for gifts, which is we have to look to see whether that conference organizer or the person who's offering to pay for your travel, are they an interested source? Do they have a vested interest in trying to influence you? In which case, you probably won't be able to accept those travel payments, and maybe you won't be able to deliver the speech at all. So, again, just for form, we gave you the things to consider, but this is kind of repeat of some of the stuff before. Can't be first-class tickets, and you have to examine it through the optics test. Would this look bad if you took this payment? And then we dive right into what this analysis is really all about. Whether you're talking about gifts or official activity expenses or honorarium. The first time we mentioned honorarium, so I usually offer a quick little example. These are the kinds of things where you're offered a payment for things that you're doing that aren't related to your job. So maybe that same guy who's given a speech in D.C., maybe he's also personally, in his personal life, he's a butterfly collector. And he was offered an honorarium to write a speech or write an article for Butterfly Collectors Monthly magazine or something like that. Make an example that makes them laugh if you can. And, that's the kind of thing we're talking about for an honorarium. They're not related to your job. But you still have to do the same analysis. Anytime they're going to receive something of value, you have to look to see whether it's offered by an interested source. Does it appear to be a conflict of interest? Could it look to somebody on the outside as though this thing of value was intended to reward you or influence you in some way? And that's it. So what we're talking about, this is a refresher. What we're really drilling down on is helping people to know how to think about these situations so that they can make good judgment calls in the moment. This analysis slide here will really help bring that home, that it's the same kind of thinking regardless of what kind of situation you're in. And I think this helps people who are not attorneys to stop getting bogged down in, well, does this violate the gift rules or this rules or that rules? Like, you know what? It's the same thinking regardless of what activity you're looking at. It's a thing of value. You got to make sure that it can't look as though you're being rewarded or influenced.
Yes. Interrupt one more time. If anyone cares about what we were talking about before about that Christian charitable fundraiser, I had another attorney's grab what our former director had said. So the example he gave in the newsletter, somebody asked the same question, is it okay to take the golfing at a charitable event? He said the scenario in the newsletter involved an employee of DMV and attending a coaches versus cancer charity golf outing on the nicest course at Turning Stone, where a round of golf normally costs $225. Because the fact that the event fits within the charitable event exception does not eliminate the need to consider COL 74 that I had remembered. So I remember something today. And then he went on to say, maybe for a DMV employee there would be no issue, since the DMV has no interaction I'm aware of with the Oneida Indians. But what if the state employee were a New York State trooper or an employee of tax and finance? I can assure you there is interaction between the Oneida Indians and those agencies and has the potential to be quite contentious. So he said,
so situational and yeah, so it's okay.
And also, just quickly, I think this is a really important point that we always try to make within our training, is that we always try to tell our filers that we're just giving them a general awareness, right? Like our job as trainers is just to arm them with potential red flags. So if any of these topics come into their day-to-day work environment, they know that they need to come to you, first off and foremost, if any of these situations apply. We're not actually expecting them to go through the gift analysis and make a determination on themselves and say, yeah, I think that is a widely attended event, and I think I can go to that. That we really want to just drive that point home. That really for all of these topics that you cover later on, if you choose to do this training, that these are all areas that they really need to feel comfortable either coming to you or coming to us. And that's really the point that we're trying to drive here.
All right. Now this is where we change. We've been talking about a lot of the laws. We've been talking about it through examples. But this is where we shift the discussion and we start talking about the culture of the state and how being a state employee, as I said before, being a public servant means that we're held to a higher standard. So we shift gears and go into more theoretical, higher level perspective taking here. I can tell you that when we did this same presentation for our commissioners, when they saw this training for the first time, this was the part of the training that they loved best. They loved the idea that what we're trying to do here is message integrity as a cultural value for the state. We all know what the reputation is in New York State for ethics, right? So this is a part of the conversation that is really valued to try to help increase the professional standing of us all. So we start by talking about the integrity standards. You want to go on that?
Sure. We don't really read these verbatim, but again, we just touch upon the main points. Again, we remind them that there really is no civil penalty associated with them. However, they could face disciplinary action. Again, bringing back that tie that, separation from state service often applies when these two standards are violated. And here for standard F, we're really talking about influence here and making sure that it's not going to appear to someone that you're looking for favor, that you're looking to be influenced, or that you are influenced by someone's familial ties, their rank, position, authority, things of that nature. A standard H, again, we focus on misconduct, and again, we drill this point home over and over and over again, and just examining your specific set of circumstances through the lens of the public and making sure that there's no misconduct there. And again, we chime in with our Report Misconduct Initiative, reminding our filers that it does exist, again, through our website and through our 1-800 number.
F for favors, H for honesty. That's how I remember.
So here I use some of my own personal experience. I typically will, again, poll the audience and ask them how many of us have worked in private sector before we came into public service. Most of the time it's a majority in the crowd. And I use my own personal experience. Feel free to use your own. I've always been in communications, so I talk about my time in radio and TV news, as well as advertising and how most business is done at lunch during the private sector, right? We used to have access to expense accounts. We often used to reward our clients with paid business lunches, or we would use these lunches as a way to kind of get new clients, as well as gifting was all regularly accepted business practices, right? Like the culture of the state is completely different than private sector. These are all okay, right? When we all worked at the private sector, this is our day-to-day business, right? We would take people out to lunch, and we would often gift them with either tickets to concerts or sporting events and things of that nature, and that was all acceptable. That was all right. However, when we transition into the public sector, all of that changes, right? And no longer do we have access to these expense accounts. We're no longer going to be taking out a vendor to an expensive paid business lunch on taxpayer dimes, right? And gifting, we can't receive or accept a gift, right? That might be intended to either reward or influence us, right? But here really the touch point is that for those filers who still continue to work with private sector vendors, 98% of the time, 99% of the time, these private sector vendors aren't trying to jam up our filers in ethical violations. This is just how they normally conduct their business. So the onus is really on us, right? As FDS filers, as state officers and employees, to be aware of these rules, so that way we can make sure that we're not accepting the illegal gift, that we're not accepting the inappropriate paid business lunch and things of that nature. So that's really the message behind that slide.
Right, and then this is another transition slide because, you know, I think Marlene's point is a good one, that these private sector people, they aren't necessarily, again, good intentions. They're not necessarily trying to get somebody in trouble, but that's, again, we circle back, that's why you're here, attending training, you know, arm you with awareness, because what we're really trying to do here is foster a culture of ethical behavior in the public sector. So this is that key concept. So what does the public expect from us anyway? You don't have to really lecture them here, but this is just bringing these concepts. You know, if you ask somebody to define integrity, that's actually a really slippery concept. It can be very difficult for somebody to, like, you can talk around it in a lot of different ways, but really nailing down a definition of integrity can be difficult. So the purpose of this slide is to just front load them with a lot of key insights that relate to integrity, accountability, fairness, equality, transparency, honesty, stewardship of state resources. Yes, they expect all of that from us. For public servants, our standards are high. So that moves us into that being in state service has a number of different components, number of different factors. The first is that serving in a public office is a public trust, and there's a number of ways that we serve the public trust. And the first is that FDS form. Nobody loves to fill those out, but that is an important component to building trust with the public. You are offering transparency to the public, and that helps the public assure themselves that you're not you're not engaging in self-dealing, right? That's at least the point of that FDS form. I don't know if it actually really makes anybody feel better about filing them, but we offer that. But this is why we also have ethics training, but we also, that public trust means that we also provide these filers with ethics officers and JCOPE as a resource to help them navigate through these different scenarios. So that's the first. The second is that we are here to serve the public interest, not our own personal interest. Again, people know all of this stuff, but we're just taking a moment on this slide to make it really explicit. So it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest, to maintain our impartiality, and to avoid the appearance of impropriety. Because, and if you haven't hit this point before, this is definitely where you need to hit it now. Because what we're really talking about here is developing that bigger ethical picture thinking. We want you to ask, not is it legal, but is it ethical? If you take that bigger picture and apply it to your scenario, you're more likely to navigate through those pitfalls better than when you stay focused on is it legal.
Probably.
I know that we have a lot of attorneys in the crowd here today. It was an attorney who pointed out the way our thinking shifts.
Kramer and Blake.
If you stay focused on is it legal, then what you're really looking for are the loopholes. How can I navigate through, right?
Oh,
we don't want you to be looking for loopholes. We want you to be taking the bigger picture and engaging in generally ethical behavior. And for all of our participants who aren't attorneys, that tends to be the approach that makes most sense to them. Keep the bigger ethics picture in mind, and then consult your
Kramer was one, right?
attorney if you need to know about the legalities of behavior.
And also, if you get tripped up, if you're in the middle of a training and someone offers you a 10-part hypothetical,
Kramer's done.
I often turn it around on the person that will ask us that and say, okay, why don't we reframe that as a headline?
Blake, I'm sure, is done.
As a headline, as a newspaper story, as a 30-second intro on TV. Is it going to pass that?
Yep, Blake is gone.
Is it going to be a thumbs up or is it going to be a thumbs down when it comes to the public? And that's a real good way of shifting that
MHU
hypothetical.
testimonies.
Make it a headline.
Right. Yeah. Because as soon as people start seeing their own name in a hypothetical headline, that does change thinking pretty quick. So this is where we're going. Instead of staying focused on is it legal, ask the bigger question, is it ethical? If you haven't let them know that you're really training them in decision-making skills, this is where the cat's out of the bag. Yes, this is what we've been doing all this time. We're helping you think about these things. So now we offer another real-life example. One of you today may actually recognize this. This was an example that an ethics officer brought to us. If you're a new ethics officer, maybe you don't know this, we do ethics forums periodically, a couple of times a year, on specific topics that we know have a lot of confusion. And we invite the ethics officers to come and hear our attorneys discuss the various issues. And they brought this scenario. They were like, all right, well, how about this one? We've got a policymaker who wants to hire an employee to do some remodeling work. It's unrelated to their positions. This guy is not in direct supervisory position to the potential contractor. They're going to pay market rate. They're not related to one another. There's no supervisory relationships here. They did note, though, that policymaker does have a significantly higher pay than this person that they want to do the job. So they brought the scenario. They said, well, what do you think? This is an example of, while it may be legal, it may not be the right thing to do. So ethical decision-making can get complicated, and this is one of those complicated things. On the surface of this scenario does not violate any of the strict statutory guidelines. However, once you start thinking like a lawyer, here's our things to consider slide. we usually run these questions out to the crowd. At this point, they're usually participating a little bit. We're like, all right, well, what would happen if this, if the employee, is this the job that the employee would want to take, or do they feel obligated to take this job just because this is a high-ranking person in their agency, right? How do you determine whether or not there is any kind of coercion or influence going on there?
You can touch on the coercion that we talked about later on at the beginning of the presentation.
And even if they do want to do the job, would they feel obligated to offer their best price to somebody within that agency, right? Special discount. Now we're getting into the special discounts for the person who's asking for the job. How do you know what market value really is? When, contracting market value can be weird. But here's where people start to go, oh, what happens in contracting jobs? If you've ever had a contractor in your house fixing anything, as soon as you open up a wall, you open up a can of worms, right? So what happens if this job goes sour? What happens if there are unpredictable things in the job? Now you've got a situation potentially where two employees are in dispute with one another in a personal matter, but they still have to work together professionally, right? So, and then we conclude with the final one, could this appear to be some sort of conflict to the public, right? Because that's the final optics test. So as soon as we start going through these questions, people go, oh, right. So this is technically legal, but is it wise? Maybe not. And that ultimate final question, can it give the appearance that there could be something, a conflict of interest there? That is, I think, a really good guidance reminder to them. Keep the optics test in mind, because even though it may be legal, it may not be the wisest course of action.
And it gives your participants a really good understanding of the types of questions and why you ask them the questions that you ask them when they come to you for specific approvals. It allows them to kind of be the ethics officer in that example.
Yeah. Oh, and we usually, I'm going to go back just for a second, we usually use this slide and several of the examples to heap praise and love on you guys as ethics officers, by the way. I will be very clear about that. When we say, you should contact your ethics officer, we will also say, please be kind to your ethics officers. By and large, you're generally overworked people. For many of you, being ethics officer is just like one small task of a much larger job, and you have to juggle all of this knowledge and provide advice. So we usually give you lots of love. We tell participants to treat you well. So, for what that's worth, just to throw that in there too. So what happens if we fail? Again, this relates to our consequences slide, right? Everybody, you're telling a series of stories, everybody wants to know how the story ends, but this time the story is us, right? So what happens if we fail? Our reputation suffers. Now, when we were talking about one of the first examples, the case of the fallen tree with that FEMA director who redirected workers, we make a point that not only does our reputation suffer, but our agency as a whole, FEMA was looking, or the State Emergency Management team was looking bad because of that one guy. And the reputation of state government suffers. We have all heard the state worker jokes before. I'm sure you have your own favorites to share. So this is, you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time here, but this kind of closes the loop. It gives the consequences and it drives home that this is why we're held to a higher standard, because these are the consequences when we fail. So the buck stops with you. We do try to, though, offer some final steps. We don't want to leave anybody on a negative note, right? But say, so, you know, ultimately it belongs to the FDS filer, state employee, to know how to navigate this. We give you lots of things to help you. We give you the laws. JCOPE is here to give you advice and guidance. Your agencies are there. They provide ethics officers. Sometimes general counsels or agency heads also can provide some guidance there. But as state employees, they have training that increases their awareness. They also know to report misconduct, because ultimately it's up to the state employee to behave the way they should. We can only do so much. Yes, sir. Question?
I guess that means seeking guidance from the ethics officer or JCOPE doesn't provide a safe harbor for you know, for an individual who has a question.
Right. Does seeking advice provide safe harbor? Kind of yes and no.
Depends if you've already done it.
True that. We can't provide retroactive cover for violations, but we will stand behind the advice that we give as an agency. So, and we've also been very upfront about that. You know, if when you contact the attorneys of the day, it's confidential, and you can just have an informal conversation with an attorney on the phone, and that's fine. If you're the kind of person who would like it in writing, you can communicate with the attorneys via email, and then you've got your record. And if we have given you advice on a situation that you acted on, and then later circumstances turn squirrely, we'll stand by the advice that we gave you. So, yeah, but you got to ask in advance. We don't do it retroactively. So, whether or not an ethics officer will stand behind their advice, I can't speak for each agency's ethics officer. But that's why I know as ethics officers that you can also come to us for advice. So if you have a situation that you can't navigate yourself, call the attorneys here. Walk it through with them. Every situation is different. And even though you're very thoroughly comfortable with these laws, there's always going to be a person or a situation that's going to add a spin on something. You go, oh, well, that's a new one. That's weird. Let me check on that. You give us a call. The attorneys will walk you through it. And that way you can feel confident that when you're passing on advice to your staff, that you at least have JCOPE's cover. We'll cover for you. We're a service-oriented agency in that regard of that. So our final thoughts for folks here. So how do we improve the culture of ethical behavior here in New York State, so that we're not so much of headline or, you know, source of humor for others? So we seek guidance. The point of this training is to help our participants know where to go for help and under what circumstances they should, right? So general awareness. We don't expect people to walk out of an hour-and-a-half training knowing everything they need to know, even as a refresher. But at least when they walk out the door, they should feel confident that it's okay to ask for guidance on situations, and they should have at least a couple of or avenues for that. Either you as an ethics officer, or you can bypass them straight to us. We'll be happy to talk to them. We practice ethical decision-making. This is what we've been talking about throughout the training, trying to help people find ways to think about these ethical situations. And we do encourage people to use our 1-800-87-ETHICS hotline or reportmisconduct.ny.gov website. That is honestly how we do get quite a few of our tips. It's people people keeping their eyes open and saying, that's not right, and then letting us know. So here's the last slide. It gives general contact information. There's a misconduct line for people who want to contact the Attorney of the Day program via email. That's legal@jcope.ny.gov. Have questions about training or education or this course, there's the education@jcope.ny.gov. Excuse me. So that's it. It usually takes, we still don't usually end this early. This presentation usually lasts about 90 minutes. It's a little bit longer today because we knew we were going to be providing additional commentary on the slides. Excuse me. So what I would like to say, I'm going to open it up for some questions first, but let me just finish up some housekeeping. As I said in the beginning, we wanted to present this material. It's very different than the CETC, right? So we wanted to present this material with this kind of commentary so that you could evaluate for yourself whether or not you feel like this course is a good fit for your agency, whether you feel like you have the means and the mechanisms to be able to offer this training. We tried to offer you support like trainer notes and whatnot to help you out. If you leave here today and you've decided, yeah, I like that. I think I'd like to do that. Fantastic. You're going to use that email address, education@jcope.ny.gov. And you're going to say, sign me up. I'd like to do that. And we will send you the, just like we do for the CETC, we'll send you the slide deck, we'll send you the PDF of the participant guide, and we'll send you a blank version of the certificate of completion that you can use to give to your participants afterwards. That's an important piece. That's their documentation that they've completed their training. So we will send that package off to you. Now, it'll probably take us about a week to process this video and then get it loaded to our website. So if you send us a request this afternoon and we don't answer you for a week, I don't want you to panic, because what we want to also do is, what we intend to do, if technology does not fail us, is we're going to also include a link to this recording whenever we send out this material. You can ignore it, or you can review it as you wish, or if you're having somebody else in your agency do the training for you, that gives them the opportunity to see today's presentation as a way to help prepare them for delivering this seminar. All right, so it's going to take us just a week. We're not going to make the link public because we don't necessarily think that what we discussed today is, a publicly accessible thing. What we do, we're going to put it on the website. We're going to have like a private link that we can send you so you have access to that material. So, for those of you who are here today in person, if you are an attorney, I just want to say that you have, CLE rules are, you have to sign out on the sign-out sheet and also return a CLE evaluation. That's how you get credit. I apologize for our WebEx participants because of the CLE attendance verification rules that we are not approved for. I can't offer CLE credit for those of you who are attending today. And I want to thank you for being flexible enough with the snowstorm that we had last week that caused everybody's calendar to get scrambled. So those are my last pieces of housekeeping. So are there questions either through WebEx or in person about the training materials or any other issues that we can clarify and or confuse you with before we send you on your way? Yes.
I have a question.
Okay. All right. I'll hold your question. Question from New York. Go for it.
Okay. Hi.
So on page 14, when you talked about outside activity, policy-making positions, is that meant to say that it only applies to policy-making? Because there's no, my understanding at least, that public officers law 273 applies to everyone, irrespective of how much money they make or what category they're in.
I'm pretty sure that the regs, the outside activity regs, only apply to policymakers.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking at page 18 of the plain language guide, and I'm just confused because maybe I'm reading, they have a context, but all covered individuals, both policymakers and non-policymakers, should evaluate whether the intended outside activity is appropriate under the rules of Public Officer 73, and is not a conflict of interest under the rules of Public Officer 74.
Public Officer Officers Law 73, you are correct. It contains the same umbrella of individuals that Public Officers Law 74 does. The big distinction with 73 is that it does not include those unpaid or per diem. But what we did was, well, not we, but what the attorneys did here at JCOPE was when they issued the regulations themselves only speak to policymakers. But Public Officers Law 73 applies to all of your members, boards, directors, your commissions, departments, bureaus, all of that same jurisdiction that falls under 74. But the regulation itself only applies to those policymakers. The approval process is just for policymakers and has evasion.
Unless your agency wants to impose stricter rules. And I'm going to use my real world life experience at the comptroller's office. We would say to folks, if you're not a policymaker, we still suggest you come, but we didn't require it. So, I mean, some agencies might actually make everyone come for outside activities.
So we have a few questions, but my question right now is there any way you can summarize for us the differences between what applies to policymakers versus threshold filers? And we keep making this distinction in a training room.
Threshold, oh, go on. Well, can we briefly summarize that here? No.
Okay.
Looking at the clock now. So there is a difference between the public officers law and the regulations, and the regulations are the ones that have specific population carve-outs. So like, using outside activities, as an example, those regulations are only applied to policymakers, but that is something that I'm sure that we could provide for you, but if you send us a request, we can help you suss that out.
Okay, great. And so on 23, speaking of specific exceptions and specific populations, I've worked with CUNY, and that whole honoraria thing that flips for faculty where they're actually expected to participate in these kinds of speaking engagements, travel, and that's what they do. I'm just wondering, when you look at page 22 to 23, and we're talking about the official activity expense payment, is the premise of this whole discussion in these slides, when you are doing something that is otherwise within your scope of responsibility, is that an underlying, when it says official activity expense payment, is that a premise of it? And is it that the flip for the CUNY faculty is that it really is yes, because it's in there, because it's what they're supposed to do, it's one of the exceptions designed to do.
So, yeah, to be honest with you, we could talk about, again, this offline, but
Okay.
Official activity travel expense reports, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying. If it's part of your state duties to travel and you're getting paid by a sponsor, I mean, go into that reg. Talks about the keep saying disqualified source. If you've been an ethics officer long enough, you know it's now interested source, but it used to be disqualified source generally. There's rules about who you can't take those from, but those are pretty in-depth regs if you wanted to get more down in the weeds about them, but I'm not sure this is the place to do it today.
Right. I don't want to.
The honoraria
Feel free to, sorry.
Go ahead. And the honoraria regs do carve out special exemptions for our CUNY and CUNY folks.
Okay, last question. And this is just a pet peeve thing. Why is it that only folks who fill out financial disclosure, forms are the ones that we mandate training for? When the training is really all about ethics.
Well, we typically say, that's a good opportunity to talk to your local legislative representatives, because that was just, we didn't write the law, we just have to enforce it. So that was very specific. The law only provided for us that we are responsible for training those individuals who are FDS filers regardless of whether or not they are policymakers or threshold filers. However, again, as we've mentioned in other areas of this training, agencies have the ability and flexibility to be able to train not only their FDS filers, but they can train their entire population, and we often encourage that. However, the training unit right now is 4 individuals, so it's difficult for us to be able to try to train the entire state workforce. However, we do rely on our ethics officers to take some of that burden away from us, but we do encourage those agencies that have the availability and the time to be able to train their entire population.
Okay, thank you.
The Governor's Office of Employee Relations is working on a general ethics training course for all state officers and employees, so that that poor schlub who was doing laundry at the SUNY school won't get caught up with the free swag. So there is a generalized ethics training course that is in progress. We don't have a hand in creating it, but they have consulted with us on a couple of points, so we know that it is forthcoming. So,
but it will only be available to those agencies who have access to the statewide learning management system. Yeah. That's an FYI.
yeah, that's so, I don't know. It's a go or thing. So it's going to be mandatory. So stay tuned. They'll figure it out. So you have a question?
I think we kind of got to
Oh, wonderful. How is your day going?
But just to be clear, faculty members at the
Are you okay?
if they're doing something related to their
What's
expertise,
up? What is it?
they don't need prior approval, but they still need to report
What
on
is it?
areas that they received. Is
All
that
right.
correct?
Yeah. The question was, just to be clear, if you have a faculty member at a SUNY or CUNY school who is conducting an activity that is related to the areas of their expertise, they do not need to get advanced approval of their honorarium request. And yes, that is correct. Because
Need to report that.
you do need to, yes, they do need to track their honorarium because that is still reportable on the FDS form.
There are very specific titles. I believe that they're outlined in our regulations that drill down who that applies to that
Okay.
applies.
All right.
Just so you guys know, 930.7 is the exemption for SUNY.
And that's in the honorarium. Right?
Yes.
Okay.
And if they donated back the money that they, let's say I went and spoke in school as a faculty member, I went and spoke at SUNY Oswego instead, and they gave me money, but I donated it back to U Albany, do I still have to report that? So I if we get back to
That would be a question to suss out. With
Yeah,
us.
you want to, I can give you my contact information and look into that.
Thank you. All right. Where are we with questions? We got a few more minutes. I don't want to rush you out the door, although I know the temptation is just to say, woohoo, we're ready to go, yay! Okay, question?
Employees on you directly.
Yeah.
I don't know, I guess I got the impression that they really probably should come to me first before they call you. But they can pick up a phone, call you and ask you questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not me personally, but one of the attorneys today.
The question was, can a staff member bypass the ethics officer, just call us directly? Do we really mean that we want them to do that? I was paraphrasing what I think you meant. But yeah, I mean, we do encourage, we make a great point to our participants who come to us, say, look, your ethics officer is your best first line of information, because really we're going to be offering advice based on a close reading of public officers law, right? But as Megan pointed out, agencies are empowered to impose stricter standards than what the law calls for. And so the ethics officer really, we try to encourage staff to go to you first, right? But we also know that sometimes a high-ranking staff member may be in a position where there might be a reason why they don't necessarily want to run something past somebody within their agency first, and in which case we want to make sure that we keep lines of communication open so anybody can contact our attorneys and receive confidential guidance and advice. And we really are okay with that, and that really is fine. Even though, I mean, Megan will probably, on the days when she's the attorney of the day,
Monday, by the way.
Days that I know that she is just, that's all she does that day.
I like talking to people, you can call me.
But, right? So, I mean, it is a big lift for us to do, but we feel like that's an important part of what we do as an agency. I mean, we're often referred to as the watchdog agency in the media, and While that is definitely one essential function that this agency does, can I tell you, it happens behind locked doors in another part of the building. I never even see investigations, right? For what we see in the agency, advice and guidance, this is really central to what we do. We have a whole team of attorneys who that's all they do is offer advice and guidance and craft regulations. So we really are a service-oriented agency. We are here to partner with you as ethics officers. You know, the whole point of this new FDS system and tracking training in that system, the whole point of that system was to reduce the burdens on you as ethics officers. We're trying to work with you in partnership. We're all bound by these rules, but we're working together to try to make this happen. So insofar as we're able to help you, we are happy to do so, genuinely. All right. Any other questions for the good of the order?
I'm just going to read a question from one of our WebEx participants. It says, would this presentation be counted if used at my facility as the 3-year refresher? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. So for anyone that's already taken CETC, they need to at least, all of your filers need to take the CETC at least one time. So once they take it, so let's say they take it today, then their due date would be 3 years from today to have to take refresher training. And as Kate mentioned early on in the presentation, they have 2 options, and you also have 2 options as to what you want to present. You can either have your filers retake that CETC, or if you choose to present the JCOPE Ethics Seminar that we've all gone through today, then this also qualifies as refresher training, okay, for that ongoing training requirement.
Oh, let me sweeten the pot. Here's something that we've been meaning to really message more for you. Many ethics officers are also FDS filers themselves. Not all, but many of you. And even some of the people that you have assigned as training delegates are FDS filers. So here's the thing. Every time you either train the CETC or if you choose to accept the mission, this new training program, every time you train it, your personal refresher clock is reset. So keep track of when you offer training, because you can run into the FDS system and update your own training date for every session that you do.
And on that note, because the new FDS application allows you to enter training completion dates, we've been messaging to all of our ethics officers in various forms to please enter in that training information sooner than later into the system. That way it gives us both an accurate idea as to the agencies that may be struggling in getting their participants trained, and that way we can kind of step in and provide that assistance. As well, it also allows you to be able to keep better track as to the filers who may be overdue or whose training completion dates are coming closer.
Yeah, if you enter training dates or assign staff to enter training dates every time you hold a session, then what we're hoping for is to do away with the entire end of the year training compliance report madness. You no longer have a certification or any additional hoops to jump through. We know that you have hoops to jump through for the FDS team. But as for training, enter the training dates in a timely manner to the best of your ability. And that way, at this time next year, we'll just send you a friendly reminder email. Make sure you get those last dates in, and then you're going to send us a thumbs up. We're good. That will be your annual report next year. So the whole point of getting the system through all of the bug checks is to try to make it easier for you guys, reduce the burdens again on what we're asking you to. So what do you think? Do you like this course?
Yeah.
Yeah? All right, fantastic.
Yeah.
We are looking for feedback. We are looking for feedback. So although I didn't bring down or send out any course evaluation forms, I would say, just as a personal plea, because we are always looking for ways to improve the courses that we offer. If you do have some specific feedback, and feedback can be positive or negative, if you have something constructive that you think is useful, if you've noticed something that could be changed or done better or done differently, please drop us a line at education@jcope.ny.gov. We would very much welcome your professional expertise, because you've been training the other material. We would like to hear any feedback that you may have about this material as well. All right?
Pat, I think we'll change that one slide to, I think that's a good point you have made.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So if there's no other questions, I will bid you a good afternoon. Thank you very much for being willing to schedule this training program, and we look forward to hearing from you.